So, hi Nicky.
Hello.
Could you give us, to start with, a brief overview of what your role as Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport involves?
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me here to De Montfort University. Digital Culture, Media and Sport is a fantastic department to be Secretary of State of. We've obviously got all of the policy relating to digital, to tech businesses, to data. So we have something like the Centre for Data and Ethics. We're looking at artificial intelligence policy. Culture involves really arts, heritage, tourism, music, all the things. I mean, we have some fantastic stats of how much UK music, for example, is played around the world, how well our artists are known, cinema and all sorts of things. Media obviously involves the regulation of the media, but also, and we'll come on to talk about this, I think, about how we make sure that freedom of expression, freedom of the press is upheld, whilst making sure governments, stands clear of a lot of those debates in a way. And then sport is what it says on the tin, really, which is supporting our sporting prowess, planning for big events. And the Secretary of State, my job is I've got 4 ministers who look after those areas specifically. There's a department of quite a few hundred people, and making sure we're all pulling in the same direction, and then also making sure that DCMS is represented around the cabinet table and with number 10, the Prime Minister, as well as making sure we're also finally sending a great signal about our capabilities around the world too.
Great. So within your role, what do you think of the transition to online platforms from more traditional forms of media like television and radio?
Well, I think it's a challenge. It's exciting. There's no doubt that we are seeing more broadcasters, more platforms out there. There's sort of radio stations, and the way we consume our media is changing too. So people like to listen to podcasts. They like to watch streaming, programs over streaming as and when it suits them. So I think the point is that with the internet and the growth of all these different channels, we're not going to undo that. So the challenge, I think, for traditional, perhaps public sector broadcasters and others, public service broadcasters, is how do they match that challenge and thrive in that way.
And you mentioned, obviously, people streaming things on demand rather than watching at set times, which has obviously been the traditional route. What do you think is behind that trend?
I think that people are very busy these days, and people lead busy lives, and people work different hours from perhaps traditional hours, 9 to 5, a number of years ago. People obviously you can watch now. I go up and down to London on the train a lot, and it's extraordinary the number of people who are sitting there watching things on their phone, on their tablets, on their laptops, things they've downloaded, and that's good in a way because I suspect that a lot of content that might not be seen live is then enjoyed on catch up. So I think it's just a sort of feature of our lives. I think also people are more specific now about, they know what they want to watch, and they don't want to watch lots of other things they don't want to see before they get to the programme they do want to watch. I think undoubtedly it provides a challenge for our public service broadcasters, but equally it's great to see things like ITV and BBC collaborating to come up with BritBox, which is going to be launching in the next few months, and be really exciting to see how that goes. And I'm sure there'll be more. I mean, I think what we're seeing in a way is the pace of change is going to get quicker, and so I think everybody is going to continue to sort of keep changing their business models and upping their game to make sure they're meeting customer demand.
Yeah. So you spoke about BritBox, which is ITV and BBC, which is traditional broadcasters. But do you think that traditional broadcasting is sustainable in the long term as it competes with the plethora of content online? So will they be able to stay as they are on TV channels as such?
Well, I'm not sure they'll be able to stay as they are, and in fact they're not staying as they are at the moment. So if you think about it, all the on-demand ways we watch programmes produced by traditional public service broadcasters already. So, obviously iPlayer, you've got the ITV Hub, you've got Channel 4 on demand. And I think they know, I've met all of them since taking over the role. They all know that they're going to have to change the way they do things. And I think they're also thinking very hard about the demographics they serve. And I think in a way, same challenge for politicians. We've got people, older people with what they want to watch. You've got sort of, perhaps people are working with less hours in the day to sit down and watch content, and then you've got younger people who again have got very particular views about what they want to watch, the voices they want to be hearing from. And I think that our public service broadcasting is very sustainable. I think they're rising to that challenge. I think the quality and the brand they offer both in the UK and around the world cannot be beaten, and I want to make sure I'm championing that.
Fantastic. And I think to move on to a slightly separate area of media, what do you think about the importance of independent journalism, and do you think there are any potential threats to that?
I think it's phenomenally important. I think freedom of the press is a fundamental tenet of a developed democracy, basically, and I think we have to guard it at all costs. And I think it's slightly difficult in a way for politicians and government. I mean, I can say that, but how that actually happens, we have our role to play. So we saw a number of years ago, for example, the independent self-regulatory system Impress set up. My predecessor, in fact a couple of predecessors ago, commissioned something called the Cairncross Review that was looking at independent journalism. And Frances Cairncross, it's a really interesting report, and I hope that students interested in this will have perhaps watched, read it and seen more about it, because she's talking there about how the critical parts, particularly of local journalism, things like reporting on court proceedings, reporting on council meetings, publishing statutory notices, are a critical part of our society and what holds us together. So, I absolutely want to defend freedom of the press, right. But I also want to work with the press in order to make sure, and others, look, at the end of the day, we all know that mistakes can be made, things can go wrong, and making sure that voices are listened to, but to make sure we absolutely uphold that freedom.
So, do you think that audiences have a right not to be offended? And if so, how can broadcasters balance this with the freedom of expression?
Well, I think it's a real challenge. I think this is where Ofcom comes in. I think this is where government ministers should not, in a way, tread, because, I think it is for those, in this case the regulator, Ofcom, to have a view on that. But I think it also mirrors, doesn't it, what we've seen on some of our campuses, where there's been a lot of campaigns for having safe spaces and people not wanting to be offended, or people having to give lecturers having to give warnings at the start of lectures, for example, about some of the content they're going to cover. And I guess with all these things, it's trying to strike a balance, isn't it? And I think that there are times when we need whether it's our broadcasters or our university lecturers or our newspapers, to push boundaries, to make sure that voices that might not have been heard in the past absolutely are heard, and that people are aware of what's really going on in our own society, but around the world too.
So in relation to that, what do you think about the impact of content, particularly on social media, in relation to mental health, and what do you think can be done or should be done in relation to tackling potentially harmful content online?
So my predecessor, Jeremy Wright, published something called the Online Harms White Paper earlier on this year. It's now closed. We've had about 1,000 responses. We're working our way through that. And I covered some of this when I was Education Secretary as well, because we particularly looked at the issue of cyberbullying, for example. Now look, online platforms provide remarkable opportunities. There are many businesses, organisations, charities here in Leicester, in my Loughborough constituency and elsewhere, who rely on social media to get the word out about themselves, what they're doing, what they can offer as well. But I also know, both as a parent but also somebody in public life, that our social media platforms can be used very badly in the wrong hands. And the anonymity that they can offer allows people to produce abusive content, illegal content. And just yesterday I was listening to a story on the radio of a mother whose 12-year-old daughter was targeted online by a paedophile. And making sure that people are aware of the dangers without scaring them. We need to think about what is illegal offline, is illegal online, and how that gets enforced. But also I think there are some other harms, so content. I have a constituent, for example, who very sadly took her own life, and her father discovered that she had bought a book about suicide from Amazon, and I raised it in Prime Minister's Questions back in early July, I think. And so that's why this Bite paper, which proposes a duty of care, proposes having an independent regulator, is, I think, a real step forward. There are some very tough issues there, because the platforms will say they're happy to be regulated, but how that regulation works. But equally, all of us have a responsibility to make sure that we are aware of the dangers. And your point about mental health, I've done a lot of work on this area, also building resilience of young people to cyberbullying, to threats online, and also thinking about how we give guidance to people that online shouldn't affect what you're doing. So the Chief Medical Officer this year looked at the impact of online on young people, and she didn't come down with a hard and fast rule, but when you see a young person you're in contact with, or people, friends and students, not eating, not sleeping, getting into debt, getting into problems, being depressed, having their mental health affected, and that's happening because of what's happening online, then there is undoubtedly a problem.
Yeah, I think that's something students would find particularly relevant, and it's something that's very active in terms of university debate as well.
And I think people shouldn't be scared to admit that this is happening, and talking to friends is really important, but it's incumbent on all of us, I guess, to keep an eye out for people that we care for and that we know well, just to see if there are changes in behaviour. But people are sometimes embarrassed and reluctant to admit that there is an issue. So I do think the government has a role in how we regulate.
So who do you think should define what content online is harmful? Because you were saying earlier about obviously in real life it's much easier to police this type of issues because we know, what avenues to go down. But who do you think can define what's harmful when it comes to online?
Well, I think this will be one of the big debates that we are going to have about the proposals, basically. I think that's why it's important to have the regulator. I think it's not, again, for government to step in, although we can suggest. I think that the suggestion is perhaps there might be a list or some categories of things that seem to be harmful, that we know that change behaviours, for example. And obviously, as you say, what is illegal offline should be illegal online too.
So with AI and the rise of the digital age, do you think that traditional forms of culture and entertainment, like art, museums and theatre, do you think they'll be able to stay relevant, particularly for the next generation? Because we're growing up on sort of digital media, like we said before about streaming, film is very accessible, people are still going to be going out to...
I think we will. I think human beings are by our very nature social beings, and I think that opportunity to be in places where other people are experiencing the same performance or piece of art or going to a museum. So for example, I think that perhaps particularly our museums, but our art galleries too, the use of technology to be able to perhaps see, to be able to experience things, the use of headsets, for example. I know that a lot of schools now will have that, and so perhaps it might be that a class can't go to an experience, might be overseas or something, but they can have the headset and they can perhaps have a sense of what it's like. Yeah. But I still think that actually there's nothing to beat that magic of sitting in the theatre with hundreds of other people as the lights go down and the curtains open, and actually that in itself is an extraordinary sensation to be part of.
I think I agree with you on that, and I think that there's nothing quite beats a live experience.
Absolutely.
But I can see some people saying, well, as a student, for example, I can't afford to go to the theatre, and so I could just watch a recorded YouTube clip of Hamlet online, or whatever it was. And so do you think anything could be done to make those live experiences more accessible to people on a limited income or young people?
Look, always, and I think actually, to be fair, most arts organisations, or those in the creative sector, think very hard about how they make their performances, their experiences very accessible already. So for example, just here in the Curve Theatre here in Leicester, there is a 16 to I think 26-year-old sort of free membership with discounted tickets, and I think there'll be other concessions available as well. And I know that Curve think really hard, as well as do other places now, about having accessible performances. So often they'll have audio described performances, or they'll have performances particularly suitable perhaps for people with autism or other conditions, which I think is really welcome to see as well. All our museums, all our national museums are free, thanks to government sponsorship and other sponsorship too, and long may that continue. So I think anything we can do to continue to encourage that, but I don't think necessarily it needs encouragement, because I think the venues know this for themselves. And of course, what we've also seen is some of our great performances, whether it's music or art or theatre, happening through cinema. So, it might now be that you can't get to a place to go and see the actual performance, but you can go to your local cinema and go and see the experience there. And I think, I haven't actually done it, I'd love to do it, but those who have say that they've really, really enjoyed it. And often actually come to get to see more than because, of the camera angles and everything else.
Yeah, it's true actually. I think we watched a production of Richard II, I think, for our course, and like you say, you can get the theatre experience, but from those different angles, and you can really get focused in on the characters.
Exactly.
So it's quite a nice balance, really.
Precisely.
Okay, so obviously there's a lot of students around campus who are very, sort of keen about creative industries, looking into creative career paths. But I think there's also a tendency for people to think that these industries are very hard to get into, and I think some people find that quite discouraging. What would you say to them to sort of encourage them?
Well, I think if you've got a passion for something and you really want to get into it, then keep going. And I think to explore the wide variety of careers that are available in the creative industries. It's not all about being in front of the camera or on the stage. There are huge numbers of opportunities, and trying to seek work experience, seeking different experiences, whether it's at Dean Media or elsewhere. When you're at university, and a number of the different bodies, so like the Creative Industries Federation, are now doing a lot of work. I think there's a week coming up in November to highlight the different careers that are available in the creative industry. So keeping an eye out for all of that is really important.
So it's going to move on to politics now. It's very controversial.
I thought it was impossible not to, yeah.
The juicy bit.
This is the juicy bit. Why do you think young people should take an interest in politics? Bit of an easy one with the current situation, but...
Well, I think the current situation does highlight exactly why it's really important that everybody make sure that they register to vote, and that when an election comes round or a referendum, they make sure they go out and have their say. Yeah. And I feel particularly as a woman, we're just past celebrating the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote in this country. Yeah. We're still not quite there, actually. It was 1928 when all women had the right to vote, and to stand as members of parliament in 1980 as well. So, it's really important. Women gave up their lives. They campaigned to get that vote. Again, it's a fundamental part of our democracy that people do vote, and so I would urge everybody to have their say.
Can you briefly describe your own career path in politics for the sake of those who may wish to follow in your footsteps?
Well, everyone's journey is different, but I joined my party when I was 16. I was still at school. My father was a local councillor and could see that I was interested in current affairs and debating. And I carried on through university. I was involved in my university Conservative Association. Then when I was working in London, carried on being involved in the local party. And I think that's the way in for a lot of people, is to join their local party and to get involved with campaigning, knocking on doors, delivering leaflets, but also perhaps going to social events, going to party conferences. Then eventually I decided that I was going to put my name forward to be a parliamentary candidate. There's an assessment process in the Conservative Party. I think all the parties do broadly the same thing. And then you have to put your name forward, if you get through that, to stand for different constituencies. And so I stood in London in 2001 in Islington South, and then I stood in Loughborough for the first time in 2004. Wasn't quite successful. In 2005 election, came back for the 2010 election when I was successful. So it's quite a long process. Yeah. For some people it's much shorter. And I think that ability though, just to keep going. Again, I mentioned the word passion in my previous answer. Yeah. I think if you find something in life that you are passionate about, then you can deal with the knocks, because it's very unlikely you're going to be successful the first time.
Well, 16 is very young to sign up to a party, and also talking about earlier about how young people get involved. What was it that made you think, do you know what, I want to get involved, I want to go and join a party?
I think I started off just by sort of meeting people who sort of thought like me, and I had sort of debates and discussions with. I loved current affairs, I loved the news. Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister at the time, so she was a pretty inspirational female politician for those of us who were thinking about politics. Whether you agree or disagree, she was a very important figure in the political scene in the 1970s and 1980s. And I think that politics is still the way in which, if you want to make real change in your community, in your society, then actually politics is at different levels. You can be a councillor, you could be obviously an MP. At the moment you can be a member of the European Parliament, although that's going to change, we expect shortly. But it's the way to make change happen. And I've, it's a fantastic role, and I get to meet so many people. But I also say, when I go and speak to the year sixes at my local schools, which I do a lot, I say basically I'm quite nosy. I like knowing how people live their lives, and that's what politics is about.
What do you think would you say that that's going and talking to people and things like that, would you say that's the most sort of satisfying element of a career in politics, or what would you think is the most satisfying single part of it?
Well, I think undoubtedly standing up for the area that's done you the privilege of electing you, and if you can get investment in the area, or perhaps schemes delivered, if you can get ministers to come and visit and to invest, but also just the really simple things. So after this interview, in a couple of hours' time, I'll be going and do my constituency surgery, and I do that every other Friday for 2 hours. People make 15-minute appointments. They can talk to you about anything they like. But sometimes people will come with quite a simple query. They've got a house owned by the council, they can't get something fixed, Can we help? And we're able to step in and to do that.
Yeah.
It could be dealing with a big energy supply company, it could be dealing with a bank or something like that, a department of government, getting a benefit sorted out. That actually is where I think MPs can really make a difference to people's lives, as well as the big stuff. Look, being a minister, being in charge of the school system, or being in charge of, planning for the Commonwealth Games and that sort of thing, all that's really exciting as well.
I was going to say, actually, I've always thought, kind of looking at your career as well, is that the breadth of experience you can potentially pick up as well.
Absolutely.
Because you've been Education Secretary, Minister for Women,
Yep.
Secretary to the Treasury,
Yep.
and all these things. So you can get a massive, varied experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can do lots of different jobs, and often you've got to be asked by the Prime Minister if it's a ministerial job. But I also was elected by my fellow MPs as chair of the House of Commons Treasury Select Committee, which is another great role to have held. So yes, you've got all got the same basic job. Everybody does it differently, and I think the point is about being open to new challenges and opportunities, and they often come along in the most unexpected way in politics.
Well, as Laura was saying, you've had a very diverse career in politics. Is there anything in your career today that in hindsight you've done differently?
I'm sure there probably is. I think probably things I've said, and done in, whether it's in interviews or problems that with more experience, one of the first sort of frightening things is when somebody comes to you for the first surgery with a problem, and there isn't any training to be an MP. Nobody says this is how you handle casework. So it is slightly trial and error. Eventually you learn, these are the people I go to get the decision changed or made better. But that first time somebody comes, and sometimes it takes a while to think, that's the way to solve that. That's the person I can speak to. So yes, you gain things with experience. But undoubtedly, like any job and any career, absolutely, mistakes have been made.
Yeah.
And I think this is getting better now, because I think a lot of people I've spoken to understand the importance of this. But what would you say to students and young people in general who don't see the point in voting?
Well, I would say that if you don't vote, then you've basically given your vote and your voice to somebody else to exercise on your behalf. And I think nowhere is that illustrated more than perhaps the 2016 referendum, where many people feel that actually they got a result that they didn't like. Obviously some young people weren't eligible to vote at the time, but some were and didn't. And it's the same with the general election. I think that if you voted and your side is not successful, then at least you can say, well, I voted, and this is why I'm happy with what happened. But if you didn't vote, then, as I say, somebody else had their say on your behalf effectively.
That's a really good point, talking about sort of people and their vote not counting or counting. Do you think we're seeing a transition from generally centre-ground politics to more polarised standpoints? And if so, what do you think are the causes of this? Obviously Brexit is one of them, but there's a lot happening in the country right now. I think it's making people sort of just separate.
I think there's a long-term sort of frustration with problems that are not tackled. And I think sometimes we as politicians need to be braver about explaining to people what the reality and what the choices are. So, for example, if people want really great public services, which I think we all do, then we've got to think about how they're run, where we get the money to pay for them. They come mainly from taxes, and what that means in terms of the amount of money that people are going to take home at the end of the month, for example. Social care is another one, which I suspect for many students here, although I know you've got actually courses that are relevant to social care, but for many people, social care, looking after elderly, is something they don't even think about till they're, in their 60s. But the point is, how do we look after people who are older and sick and in need of care? How we do that in a sustainable way, and who's going to pay for that again, are really tricky issues. I actually think people respond really well when you set out the stark choices in front of people. But sometimes it's too easy to say, we'll sort that out, that's that. And then people get very frustrated when it doesn't get sorted out. Yeah. And I think that's what then drives people to be more polarised. And going back to what we talked earlier on social media, I think trying to boil down complicated issues to 280 characters or to a Facebook post, can bring out the worst in people.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, with sensational press as well, yes, doesn't help. I think that's, it's all influences.
Absolutely.
So to focus in on, dare I say it, Brexit.
Yes.
You campaigned to Remain in the 2016 referendum. What's your current standpoint on Brexit?
Well, I came here to this very campus to campaign for Remain, actually. The bus came at one point and I was here, I think, with balloons and placards and everything else. Look, My view is that actually we had a vote in 2016. The result didn't go the way that I campaigned for, but I do think it's a fundamental principle of democracy that MPs respect the public result of votes. And so we do need to leave the European Union. I think the big debate has been about how we do that. I have campaigned, I've voted 3 times for Theresa May's withdrawal agreement. I think it would be much better to leave the EU with a deal in place, a withdrawal deal. That would mean we could have a more orderly exit. But we talked about polarisation, and I think that the trouble is that both in the House of Commons and in the country, views are getting more polarised.
Yeah.
And people now either want to stop the referendum result completely and revoke Article 50, or they're saying let's just leave, let's get out. And I think it's after 3.5 years, people are very confused about why the referendum result has not happened, particularly when promises were made around the 29th of March this year as being the leaving date. I think we do now need to resolve this. I think it is having a detrimental effect on our politics, and there are many other issues that just don't get the airtime and the attention that they need. Obviously, I'm part of the cabinet, Boris Johnson's cabinet. He asked me to serve, which has said we'd much prefer to leave with a deal, but if we can't get a deal, then we will need to leave without one on the 31st of October. And we are preparing seriously for that eventuality, should it come to pass.
So at this point, we're unsure how Brexit will go, if it'll be no deal or a deal. But what do you think the consequences will be for students and young people for Brexit happening, both better and worse?
Look, I think life will be different. So before I did this interview, I was talking to a group of students, and we were talking about some of the schemes that enable young people to study at European universities. I would hope that we can carry on in those schemes, and the UK government has made it very clear that we would like to. I think it's really important. We've seen an announcement earlier on this week about international students being able to stay here after they've studied and to work. That's very important as well. But undoubtedly, there are debates and discussions and negotiations to be had about things like mutually recognising qualifications that people have here in the UK. They wanted to go and work in the EU. I think we will sort these things out because it's in both sides' interest to do. But undoubtedly, if we do it with a deal, that gives us a bit more time and space to do that. If we do it without a deal, then it will take some time to put those things in place. But actually, the fundamentals of our economy are strong, and I think for many students, particularly those who are thinking about finishing their university experiences, looking into jobs as well, that'll be a concern. But it's going to be different. It is a different step, but that is what people voted for.
And obviously, as a cabinet minister, you've said that we need to leave on the 31st of October, and I think events have obviously come to a head in the last week or so. And watching the debates in the House of Commons has been fascinating, I have to say. The government obviously doesn't have a majority anymore, and I think a lot of people look at it and think, how do we get out of this mess?
Yeah.
What do you think is the way to solve this deadlock so that we can get to some kind of resolution?
Well, the ideal way would be obviously for a deal to be negotiated with the EU, and for the Prime Minister to be able to bring that deal back, to put it to Parliament, and for that to be approved by a majority of MPs. And I think that will take a majority of MPs from different parties, because as we've seen before, so obviously we want the DUP, they're a very important part of the Northern Irish debate, to vote for this. There may well be hopefully some Labour MPs who will decide that actually they're going to vote for a deal too. That would be the ideal. The Prime Minister said, look, if that couldn't happen and we need to break the impasse, what he wanted last week was to call a general election. And that is the way we traditionally resolve impasses like this in this country. But of course, the House of Commons voted against that twice, so that looks like that's not going to happen. Parliament is now prorogued until the 14th of October, when we expect the Queen's speech to happen, and that week also is the important EU Council as well. I think what's unsettling for people is the unpredictability and the volatility. You're absolutely right. The debates are fascinating to watch. But also, equally, this is not traditionally the way that we do things in the UK and in our Parliament. And so I think it is unsettling for many people. Meanwhile, I think there's also a huge silent majority out there who are saying to people like me, please get on with it, please make a decision, make this happen, and then we can talk to say about the other issues as well. And so I think many people are not watching the TV, and I think a lot of this, rightly, people think I've got my life to live, I'm going to get on with it, and I'll deal with the situation as and when it arises. And that goes back to some of the polarisation that we see.
Brilliant. Well, Nicky Morgan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed for the interview.